Hey everyone, welcome back to The Lookout. Today we're going to do an interview with Dr. Malcolm North. Dr. North is a researcher in forests and fire and ecosystems. He works out of his own laboratory at UC Davis, but he also works for the Forest Service as part of the Pacific Southwest Research Station. He's been working for the last 30 years on issues related to forest structure, forest dynamics, spotted owl habitat, all sorts of cool big picture thinking on how past disturbances or lack thereof, like fire suppression and historic logging, have affected changes in forest structure. And a lot of his research now is looking at how to improve the resilience of our forests. If we're looking to restore characteristics to the forest to make them more resilient to fire and insects and drought, what's that look like? What does that mean as far as prescriptions for logging or thinning or burning or timing or any of this? So this is all stuff that kind of ties back to what we talk about a lot here on The Lookout, which is how can we get better at managing land and creating more resilient forests in the face of climate change and larger fires? How can we save what we've got left? So I enjoyed this conversation. Glad I got a chance to talk with Malcolm. Looking forward to doing it again. And thanks for supporting The Lookout and making conversations like this possible. So I was just up, I went on a field trip up to Meadow Valley with the AFRC to look at the Meadow Valley thinning projects. And we were talking quite a bit about work that you've been doing along with Brandon Collins and Rob York and
Scott Stevens and Lex Bernal was on there, as well as Ryan Tompkins.
Right. Yeah. So Ryan was out there.
Ryan was leading part of that dog and pony show, from what I understand. So yeah.
Yeah. And then I was out there with my my friend Jake, who's a forester, and he invited us to come along because he wanted us to be there to think about the prescribed fire side of it. The company I work for does prescribed fire contracting, and they've done a ton of work in the past on the plumas during the Quincy Library Group days. And so I guess I had some questions, on longer term management. If we, so the premise of the field trip was that we need to thin to a much wider spacing than we've previously considered if we want our forests to be fire resilient and insect resilient and generally to hold up to climate change. And so we went to stands that 10 years ago, I think a lot of us would have thought were resilient and looking good, projects that were done by the Quincy Library Group. But stands that we've seen now just totally get incinerated in fires like the Dixie.
Yeah.
To me, it's still kind of a reach. Because I've spent so long thinking that these forests that we we'll open up to 40% canopy closure and or 30-foot spacing or something, and then it'll be good to go. I think we're all trying to get our heads wrapped around the losses we're seeing in stands that we have thought for a long time were the right thing to do. So to go into these stands that look decent and have shade and are kind of what I'm used to looking at as healthy forest, and hear that, hey, there's 2 times too many trees in here. We need to open this up to 60-foot spacing and half these trees need to go. It's still kind of an adjustment for me, even though I have, seen firsthand a lot of the damage in the Dixie Fire. But I think for me, what is an open question is like, well, what happens after we open this stuff all up? What's it look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And I guess where I'm coming from with some of these thoughts is just that we've seen that the Forest Service has really limited capacity to follow through. And so if we look at the hundreds of thousands of acres of plantations we have that have never been thinned, like, why should we believe that we'll follow through and actually maintain? If we open these stands and then get a whole bunch of baby trees that come in, well, why should we believe that the Forest Service will actually be able to take care of those stands in 30 years from now, not just have thickets and kill the trees that are left?
Yeah. Well, if I can jump in, I think you've raised at least 3 things that I'd like to kind of comment on, if that's okay. I don't know what your format here is, if that's fine for me to just jump in.
Just a conversation.
Okay. I think we probably both shared a similar experience. I've done a lot of my work down in the Dinky Collaborative, CLFRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration area, because it's very close to an experimental forest tea kettle where I've been doing research for a long time. And Dinky was a real kind of wake-up call for me, because they had gotten funding from the CLFRP to do a fair amount of fuels treatment. Still not anywhere near on the scale that we'd like to get to, but at least last time I looked, they were treating something on the order of 7,000 to 9,000 acres a year for multiple years in a row. And then we got hit by that big 2012 to 16 drought. And many of the stands that had been treated to improve their fire resistance still had really high levels of mortality from the drought, and then the beetles coming in and finishing off the task. And I was kind of, taken aback, because I thought, oh, well, climate change, we know it's coming, but, it's probably really not going to start influencing things too badly until, another decade or two. And that just blew me away. I mean, I walked into some stands where I thought they'd done a really good job of reducing the fuels, reducing the tree density, removing the ladder fuels, and making the stand really set for the future. And they just were cremated. It was just, they just got toast by the beetles coming in and finishing off the drought stress. And so it started me thinking about, and I was having these conversations with Scott and with Brandon and Ryan, saying, this term resilience doesn't seem to be going away. And I haven't been real happy with the term, but I think we need to think about a paper in which we distinguish resistance from resilience, and what we're currently doing with much of our fuels treatment. And I would contend that mostly what we're doing with fuels treatment is trying to make the forest be able to be resistant to crown fire. And so it's focused on one particular stressor, and focused very much on trying to retain the overstory larger trees in the stand. And that's fine for fire, and fire is still a thing that's mostly kicking us in the rear end all over across the state. But that drought is not going to be the only drought, and there are many stressors in these systems. And I think that if we focus simply on the fire issue alone, we're going to get caught repeatedly by these other events that are coming at us, particularly that climate change is clearly a driver behind on some of these things. I mean, the resilience piece is a combination of forest management, in which we left the forest too dense, but then you have the drought stress that comes in with the climate change, and the two interact to really create a situation which is not going to go away. In fact, it's probably going to become more frequent and more severe. So the impetus for this paper really came from the idea that several of us were saying, wow, there's more going on here than just trying to build a very fire resistant forest. We need to be thinking about its resilience to a range of stresses and what is causing it to be susceptible to these stresses. So
Okay.
that's the first one I would talk about.
So you're saying that just because we thin the forest enough that we can have a fire go through and not kill all the trees doesn't mean that drought and beetles won't kill the same stand at that density.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And the second one I want to touch on is, you were talking about wide spacing of trees. And don't get me wrong, we talked about in this paper reducing stem density in these stands by sometimes 70 or 80%. But mostly it's removing the small stuff that's come in with fire suppression. And one of the other projects I was involved with one of my students, a guy named Mike Kuntz, did a really nice paper showing that actually the spatial arrangement of the trees helps with their ability to be fire resistant and possibly more resilient as well to drought. And so I think the comment you made is perfectly accurate. We want to reduce the density. We want to get trees generally having more distance between them. But there's a lot to be said for having this pattern, which is often described as ICO, combinations of individual trees, clumps of trees, and openings. And I think that we should be careful about just saying, well, what we really want to do is take that initial pines and lines type of planting pattern and thin it out to 30 feet apart, and then we'll be okay. Because to my mind, that's not going to work. I really think we need to have this more sophisticated spatial pattern, because it's really been shown to be important in that thing. And the third point. Oh God, what was the third point? I think I'm forgetting it now already.
Whether or not the Forest Service will be able to manage what we do next.
Yeah, now you raise a really good point with that, which also gives me a lot of pause, because frankly, when you open these stands up, you have the real propensity for them to get thickly covered with brush in the understory. And the way to, of course, keep the brush down is to restore the historic fire regime. So you'd be burning these stands every 15 to 25 years. I would love to see that happen, but I'm also not Pollyannish enough to believe that the Forest Service is just going to change like that, and that's going to start happening. And so you raise a really good point, I think, which is, if we are going to try to really open the forest up a lot more, how are we going to follow through and make sure that its successional trajectory doesn't go in the wrong direction, that it doesn't just become a shrub field that waits for the overstory trees to die and then kind of converts to being a shrub field? I have a lot of concern about that. So anyway, those were the three
concern
topics.
I had on this field trip was just that we were out in these group selections that were done during the Quincy Library Group, and they're full of pine thickets. And people were happy to see the pine regeneration. And they said, hey, one of the objectives of opening the stand is to get pine regeneration, get more pine in these fir-dominated stands. But you have this kind of narrow window, and then those pine thickets are a real pain. At what point are those thickets so tall that we can't get prescribed fire in there without torching out and killing the big trees we're trying to save?
Yeah. Well, you raised a really good question, and now I'm really going to get heretical, but one of my students, Hannah Fertel, just finished her master's thesis, and she was looking very much at how these stands deal with these pine regeneration in natural stands. So we were looking at old growth stands with restored fire regimes, largely in Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon. And the pattern that the trees grow in there is not at all like the way we go in and we plant stands afterwards, where we put them on pretty regular spacing. 75% of all the seedlings we found were in clusters, and they grow in without a detriment to growing in a cluster. In fact, this was a part that really blew me away. The trees are actually growing faster when they're growing in clusters at this age anyway, than they are for the same size, same age of trees that are growing as individuals that are, not growing in clumps. That kind of blew me away. So there really seems to be something going on there. But what's clear is that the cluster keeps on getting nibbled away at by the fire that keeps on coming back in the system. But rather than torching the whole clump up, it actually kind of forms a ring of dead trees around the outside, and you still get a shrunken clump inside. And then, of course, with the fire coming in, you got all this exposed mineral soil. And so we'd be looking at these clumps in which there was all this age structure that had developed in them, because it looks like you got death around the outside, you got more seedlings coming in, the clump kind of starts changing in terms of size and composition. But the dynamic is one of these things where you have a really thick clump, often of pine trees, and the fire kind of knocks it down and knocks it back till eventually you end up with these clumps that we see in mature stands that are like 5 to 8 trees, maybe spaced more like 15, 10 feet, 10, 15, 20 feet apart, but still kind of in a group. And that seems to be the result of how you get that ICO pattern in active fire stands.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I was reading your paper on resilience in forests, and I thought it was interesting where you talk about that forests have been shown to be resistant to pulses of stressors, but that we don't know as much about forests that have been chronically stressed and how they and that some of what we might be seeing where when we thin a long suppressed stand and then have mortality, or when we burn and the big trees die in stands that we've thinned, that might be due to longer term stress on those bigger trees.
Yeah, in fact, it comes out of a whole bunch of work that's kind of surrounded that issue with research in different directions, but particularly some nice recent papers that have shown that in terms of gymnosperms, of which conifers are a part of, that there is a real propensity for reductions in radial growth that are induced by competition. And as those radial growth rings start shrinking and getting down there, the tree becomes more and more susceptible to more minor and less stressful stresses. So particularly, as you know, one of the big problems in drought conditions is a tree gets water stressed, and the tree's defense against the bark beetles is to entomb the beetles by pitching them out. Right. And pitch production is directly related to how much water the tree has. Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of interaction going on where that growth reduction slows the tree's ability down enough so that it can't massively produce the pitch to deal with the beetles.
So it's kind of like plaque in the arteries, where it's just instead of having a nice thick vein, the tree's got these really skinny veins.
Yeah, and of course, when the beetles go in, they disrupt the water uptake mechanisms within the tree, and that's what really limits the tree's ability, and that's why the trees often die from the top down as well. Right. But that, particularly, I think with that kind of example, the drought and the beetles thing, it's clear that there's a direct negative benefit to high density and competition in these stands, because as competition goes up, the tree's vigor decreases and the growth rings decrease. And tree vigor is all about how you deal with pulses of stresses like a fire that comes through 1 year, or beetles that happen to be abundant 1 or 2 years. But that's a different type of selection pressure that the trees evolve with, because they're pulses that just last for a period of a couple of years. Competition just goes on and on and on, and we're proposing, we don't know for sure because we were doing an observational study, but it certainly it fits a lot of pieces in research and what we know about forests together, and makes a lot of sense in terms of how these trees that went through really tough times in the past, climate and fire-wise, are really we're losing a lot of them, and the mortality rates are really high in current times. And the big thing that's changed is that competition.
Okay. So one other thing that I saw in your paper I thought was interesting is you say that early foresters, they saw fire as robbing these wide open stands of the young trees, and they said that a lot of this land was only carrying 35% of the timber volume that it could support. So what did we get wrong there? So the foresters are saying, hey, we could have a lot more competition. The trees would put on a lot more wood than the stocking we have now. So what do we know now that they didn't know? Is it just a different climate era that they were thinking in?
That's definitely part of it. I think that one thing, and again, it's kind of it seems like a small idea, but it's actually kind of a little bit of a radical idea in terms of the way we manage forests versus what they're like. But several years ago, a woman named Heather Keith proposed that in terms of measuring carbon dynamics, you could actually have a difference between what a stand could maximally carry in terms of wood biomass and therefore carbon versus what it could sustain itself at a level. And she was often suggesting that sustainable levels, particularly in frequent disturbance systems like fire systems, is much lower than you could have or you could achieve if you were to keep the disturbance out of the system. Right. So you can, if you're just focusing on carbon, you can get greedy and go, oh, we'll keep the fire out of there, and we're going to pack on a whole bunch of trees, and the carbon sequestration is going to go way up. And it's true, but you've kind of taken what was a resource, to use a financial metaphor, and taken it from something like gold or muni bonds. It's very stable with those big old trees that hold onto the carbon and they don't easily die, and turned it into junk bonds, because what you've done is you've just flooded the system with a whole bunch of competitive stress from all those trees that have grown in. And this whole carbon carrying capacity idea came out of the carbon research, but recently, Roger Bales and Mike Goulden also proposed that there's a very similar mechanism going on in drought situations, in which if you get some really wet years in a row, trees will put on more photosynthesis, and they call it structural overshoot. You get too much photosynthetic surface on the trees, and it can overstress the system to where you either have some of those trees die, or you get needle and branch dieback until the system drops back down to a level where it has as much photosynthetic surface as the water in that system can support. So to me, it's a very interesting concept, but there's a lot of research which is kind of starting to coalesce around this, that you can get this overshoot tendency that basically, I think fire managed to keep the system from developing into overshoot, because you had it knocking back the number of trees in the understory, you had it removing the fuels, you kept the system from structural overshoot. It kind of was within this more limited parameter. And that's exactly what Lieberg, which was this early surveyor in the Northern California, observed when he said that fire kept the system at only about 35% of the timber it could carry. He was right. But once you pass that 35% threshold, you start getting into dangerous territory, and you're kind of gambling, rolling the dice each year, hoping that you're not going to get an extreme event like a fire or a drought, because then you may lose the whole stand.
Okay.
Wow.
Looking at the Dixie Fire.
Oh yeah. Ryan was telling me it hurts, because he's taken his kids to many of these places over the years, and almost all of them got incinerated. Where
yes, yeah, I grew up right here.
Really? Oh, right near Westwood.
I grew up in Westwood. So
in Westwood. Okay.
So yeah, you go any direction from Westwood, and you got the camp. Well, as a geographer, I started my career up here, and I always thought, well, most places I go there, I say, well, someday this is going to burn, and it'll be interesting, and what will the conditions be like? And it's like, I just didn't expect it all to happen in 6 weeks.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But when I listen to what you're talking about, is okay, we need to much more actively manage large tracts of land. And then I look at, well, that's, like it or not, fire's doing that right now.
Yeah.
And the industrial capacity, the ownership patterns, the international markets in timber, all of those forces are already playing out at the scale, at the landscape scale. And it seems clear to me that our ability to do much about it is really limited, especially on federal lands.
Yep.
So I guess my question is, well, so how do we take advantage of things like, this severity, where we have big patches within these burns that just got reset to an interval? We're back on it. Potentially, we're back on a natural fire return interval for this green forest that survived here. And so I guess one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, before we go and plant trees or go and even, salvage log along roads in a transportation system that's based on an old way of seeing the forest.
Mm-hmm.
How can we instead focus on managing this green forest we have left?
That's it's such a perfect thought. I mean, it's funny how we're both thinking along the same lines, because literally I've right until 30 seconds before I got on this call, I'm working on this paper with Mark Meyer and some other people, trying to say that, we focus often on the high severity areas in these fires, but there's a lot of low and moderate that's often more than 50% of the acreage in these fires that has gotten us maybe halfway towards being resistant or resilient to stresses in the future. And yet we take our limited resources and focus almost exclusively on the high severity areas and whether we're going to salvage log them and whether we're going to plant them with a regular type of planting pattern again. And I think we're missing a huge opportunity, because I agree with you that frankly, I would love to see more fuels treatments done out there. I think that there's real limitations as to how you can scale that stuff up, both the pace and scale, to really have much of an impact. So I do think that, the largest factor that's influencing these landscapes by far are these wildfires. And it's a case of, if you're given lemons, at least try to make lemonade out of it. And if you've got like 50 to 60% of the acreage in which you've got the initial treatment has been done by something that didn't have to go through NEPA, didn't have to go through EIS statements or EAs or all the surveys and stuff like that.
No one took it to court and shut it down.
Exactly.
What killed me on the one thing that kills me on the Dixie fire is just looking at where it reburned the Moonlight fire.
Yeah.
And seeing places in there where there were low severity patches in the Moonlight that hadn't been salvaged. But we hadn't gotten back in there and done anything with them either.
Yep.
And then this fire just, killed, so all the stuff that's green in there survived the Moonlight fire.
Yeah.
But most of it got killed.
Got high severity.
By Dixie coming back in. And so it's like, well, man, what if we would have been able to prescribe burn in here, 7 years out? Because it was 15 years after Moonlight, basically 14 years after Moonlight that it reburned. It's like, well, obviously that was too long. What if we could have gotten in there and put fire on the ground at 7 years? So I'd really like to see us, we're spending so much time planning projects in the green, projects in places that haven't burned. It's like, well, can we please plan some projects in the black?
Yep.
Can we start looking at hey, we want fire back in these low severity patches in the next 6 years? Because if not, I'm just afraid that we're going to lose them again.
Exactly.
And that especially if a lot of this red kind of type converts.
Again, we're thinking along the same lines, because a paper I did a year ago, again with Brandon and Scott and Ryan, a whole bunch of people, titled Pyrociviculture. And we really suggested, don't spend all of your effort on the high severity areas alone. Go in to the low and moderate and look at what you can do to harden it by mechanical thinning to remove the ladders. And then after 5 or 6 years later, particularly when the snags fall down and you've got heavy surface fuel loads, get in there and burn it. And you might be at the end of that period, you might have pretty restored or resilient type of forest conditions without a huge amount of effort. Just a little bit of hardening with mechanical and then prescribed fire, and boom, you could be most of the way towards having a resilient type of forest structure restored into those systems. I think we miss a huge opportunity when we just pay attention only to the high severity. We could leverage these treatments, these Dixie fire treatments in the places, before they go up again. And I'm sure you saw the paper that Alan Taylor just put out, where he suggested in the Dixie fire that the high severity that happened in the past begets more high severity in the future. Right. And I think that,
well, what else begat high severity in Dixie was logging on the Almanor Ranger District in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then the plantations they put in and never maintained. And when you look at all the area to the west of Chester, all of that just completely roasted.
I it's made me very unpopular with a lot of civiculturalists who will go unnamed, but it's really clear that when you do these pines and lines types of replanting, you are rolling the dice and hoping to hell you don't get fire until those trees are at least 60 to 70 years old.
Well, and I think, show me anywhere in California that we've got plantations that we've ever got trees out of. There's very few places that's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. Because boy, when you grow trees at that density, you get a fire in there and it's just like a series of matchsticks going off all together. It's just.
Yeah. Well, I think it brings me back to my earlier question, the rhetorical question of, since the Forest Service hasn't demonstrated its ability to manage plantations they put in the past, even just getting them thinned or burned or anything else, why should I trust you that you should log half of the forest that's still there, and that somehow you're going to change and
avoid
and
them
manage it
incinerating.
and actually manage it well? And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, I frankly have the same issues. Is that I think our response to these fires, both in terms of what we try to do by just suppressing them rather than letting them do good work in the landscape, and then when we go in and we plant them with a regular type of pattern, it's predicated on this idea that we have a lot of control over what's happening in the landscape. And I think that disappeared like 20 to 30 years ago. We've got to work with the hand we've been dealt, which is that you're almost for sure going to get fire in any particular point in the landscape within a 30-year period. So you have to build fire resistance and resilience at a very young age in these stands, and planting them on a regular pines and lines type of pattern is not going to get you there. It's going to get you wall to wall shrub coverage, which is what I've seen on the Eiler fire. And I'm sure you've seen it on a bunch of places up there. But
Okay.
it's to my mind, it is a forestry management approach, which is not adapted to the realities of the intensity, the frequency of fires, and the drought and climate stressors that are driving the landscape now.
So Beatty is the land manager in large portion of the Dixie Fire, or the Moonlight Fire.
Mm-hmm.
And I went up there with one of their foresters, and they got kind of creative after the Moonlight Fire, and they planted lower densities and they pre-commercial thin earlier age. And they actually have some fairly extensive areas in Moonlight that survived, where their 13-year-old or so plantations survived. And that's encouraging to me. And I think, so I'm curious what, Sierra Pacific and Collins and these other large landowners that have taken these huge losses, how things are going to really play out for them and what they're learning. And I'm curious if you have any interactions with, the industrial forestry side of things.
Yeah, you raise a great point. I was at a meeting at Jerry Brown's ranch where they did the Venado Declaration, and Dan Tominski was there. If I'm pronouncing his name right, I think he's
Tomaszewski.
Tomaszewski, thank you. The one of the upper management in Sierra Pacific Industries. And he actually pulled me aside during one of the breaks and he said, we've been very interested in your paper about reforestation for resilience. And we're starting to experiment and thinking about doing something different than planting on regular type of spacing. And I'll tell you, that's a more positive response than I've gotten from a bunch of civiculturalists in the Forest Service. So I think, they're at least flexible and responsive to the handwriting that's clearly on the wall. It's kind of surprising that the Forest Service, I think, has not shown the degree of flexibility that at least I'm hearing the private industry starting to talk about anyway. So whether, how many acres they put out there on the ground, I don't know, but yeah.
It seems like there's this glass wall between Forest Service research and Forest Service practice. I worked for the Forest Service almost 30 years ago, and it just been watching this kind of the whole organization kind of fall apart my whole career. And are you hopeful? Do you think the Forest Service has a future? Do you think that it'll kind of become part of the Department of Interior? Like, do you feel like we're near the bottom and we're going to come back up, or are we going to keep falling, or are we on the upswing? Where are we at?
Well, you raise an interesting point, because I think one of the things that almost everybody would respond to up until the last couple of years is we would hope the Forest Service could do better, but they are so constrained in terms of budget and workforce that even if you've got new visionary people in there, there's not all that much they can do, simply because there isn't both the money or the person power to complete all the NEPA and get everything done. Given that the floodgates of money are now open for at least a couple of years, it'll be very interesting to see whether the culture of the Forest Service can not only get up to pace and scale, but actually embrace some new thinking and new approaches. And at this point, I think it's a little early to say whether that's going to be successful or not. But to my mind, the next few years are going to show whether it's a really moribund agency that continues to go down the wrong track, or whether it kind of reinvents itself and takes advantage of this opportunity. And this, both the political will and the money that's available right now to actually do something differently.
We talk a lot about, landscape scale, changing fire behavior at the landscape scale, or creating forest structures that create a landscape scale resilience, but can we actually get it done?
To be honest, I'm not that optimistic at the moment. I'm hoping that there's going to be some revisioning of things, but you're right. The tools allow us to plan at the landscape level, and I've been part of advising on a whole bunch of Forest Service projects with very large ambitions to treat significant portions of the landscape. But the problem is that when we get into active management, whether it's either prescribed burning or mechanical thinning, an intentional act like that has to jump through all sorts of hoops, whether it's air quality regulations or it's NEPA processes for the thinning, mechanical thinning treatment. Those don't operate at anywhere near the scale that we really need to be working at to impact the landscape. I mean, the average Forest Service project is somewhere in the order of 1,500 to 3,000 acres and takes 3 to 5 years to plan and execute. And in that 3 to 5 year period, most national forests should have been treating something on the order of 80 to 100,000 acres. Mm-hmm. So it's not at all scalable to where we need to be. And the fire is the same. Problem is that the Air Resources Board will give you maybe a window of a day to maybe 3 days at best, but to really use fire extensively on the landscape, you're going to have to have much longer windows to be able to burn tens of thousands of acres at a shot. Mm-hmm. To my mind, the only thing that's kind of out there that's really helping us if we change our way of thinking about it is using these fires. The fires are having by far the biggest impact on the landscape. And if we started leveraging the opportunity that they provide, because they get us halfway to restoring the forest, I think then we'd be able to at least jump up to a higher level of treatment. It still is probably well below where we need to be, but at least it would be going in the right direction.
Yeah, I feel like we need to get better at using these opportunities created by fire, so like the Dixie Fire we kept out of the Deer Creek, Mill Creek Plateau. Mm-hmm. But now we got this great opportunity. We could put fire in here right now and there was nowhere it could go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly the paper that I'm working on with Mark these days, Mark Meyer, because we're trying to say, let's look at these opportunities that are given to us, even if they come at the hands of sometimes really disastrously large fires. But let's adapt our thinking and our management to take advantage of what's given to us. So,
being flexible.
Yep.
I mean, we've already got dozer line all the way around this thing, right?
Yeah.
We just use the other side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. When you talk about seeing that, I think just the problem is just that it's really hard to. It's a tough sell when you burn up 150,000 acres of at a high severity in 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
But it's what we have to work with. I think it's taken us 100 years to get the forest in such a wreck, and we're not going to fix it overnight. And in the meantime, fire's not waiting for us to get our act together.
No, it's not. And it's, I don't foresee anything significantly changing over the next decade. I think we're going to have more and more of these really large fires. And it would behoove us to still try to keep them out of structures and to deal with them as best as we can, but to not simply think of them as negatives and try to look at how we can leverage the opportunity that we have been given from the event.
Yeah. Well, I think at least for the immediate time period, I got no illusions that we're going to manage wildfires in California.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on the Lookout. Look forward to talking to you more. I've been, a fan of yours for a long time, and surprised we haven't connected before now, but I look forward to talking to you more about all this.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about this stuff, and it's been a real pleasure, Zeke, getting a chance to chat with you.
All right. Well, keep it up. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.